The grease-scented air of the Beacon Diner hung thick and heavy, clinging to the worn vinyl of the booths and the sweat on Clara's brow. It was 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, a time when the world was divided into the sleeping and the desperate. Clara, wiping a sticky ring of coffee from a laminate countertop, felt firmly in the latter category. The fluorescent lights hummed a tired, buzzing hymn, casting a pale, unforgiving glow on the cracks in the floor tiles and the fatigue etched around her eyes. Each swipe of her rag was a small act of defiance against the entropy that threatened to swallow the place whole, just as it had swallowed her dreams years ago. Tonight, entropy had a face. His name was Vince. He sat alone in a corner booth, a man whose presence seemed to suck the warmth from the room. He was built like a sack of concrete left out in the rain, lumpy, solid, and with a permanent scowl that seemed to have settled deep into his features. He'd been nursing the same cup of coffee for an hour, each of his demands for a refill delivered with a sneer that made Clara's stomach clench. He didn't look at her. He looked through her, as if she were just another faded part of the diner's decor. This dismissal was a familiar weight, one she carried with every plate of eggs and every forced smile. But with him, it felt sharper, more personal. "Hey, dollface," his voice was a rasp, like gravel being dragged over asphalt. "This cup's empty. You plan on doing your job? Or are you just gonna stand there looking sorry for yourself?" Clara turned, her expression carefully neutral. It was a mask she had perfected, a smooth, blank surface that betrayed none of the exhaustion or the simmering resentment beneath. "Right away, sir," she said, her voice quiet but clear. She picked up the glass coffee pot, the dark liquid sloshing within. The heat from the burner was a small, comforting warmth against her palm. As she approached his table, her shoe caught on a loose piece of linoleum, a tiny stumble that was barely noticeable. But it was enough. Vince's hand shot out, not to steady her, but to shove the table just enough to make her lose her balance completely. Hot coffee splashed over the side of the pot, scalding her hand and wrist. A sharp, searing pain shot up her arm. She hissed, biting her lip to keep from crying out, and managed to set the pot down without dropping it. A dark brown stain spread across the front of her pale pink uniform. He laughed, a low, guttural sound that held no humor, only malice. "Clumsy, ain't ya?" he sneered, leaning back in his booth. A few other patrons glanced over. A tired trucker at the counter, a young couple huddled in a booth by the window, before quickly looking away, their gazes dropping to their plates as if pulled by a sudden, irresistible gravity. Their silence was a verdict. She was alone. This was her problem. The humiliation was a hot flush that rose up her neck, more painful than the burn on her skin. She stood there, dripping coffee, a ghost in her own life, visible only when someone wanted something to break. In the far back corner, obscured by shadows and the steam rising from the grill, a group of men sat silently, their large frames filling the booth to capacity. They had been there for hours, speaking in low rumbles, but now they were still, watching. Clara took a steadying breath, the scent of burnt coffee and sugar filling her lungs. She ignored the throbbing in her hand, focusing instead on the task. Keep moving. Don't let him see it hurts. That was the rule. She reached for a wad of napkins from the dispenser, intending to clean the mess on the table. Vince's hand clamped down on her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong, his fingers digging into the tender, scalded flesh. She flinched, a small, involuntary movement, and his grin widened. "Not so fast," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow louder than a shout in the tense silence of the diner. "You made a mess. A big mess," he gestured with his chin toward the stain on her uniform. A dark, ugly splotch just below her collarbone. "Look at that. Ruined. I think you owe me something for that. An apology, at least." His eyes, small and dark like chips of obsidian, roamed over her, stripping away the thin veneer of her uniform, leaving her feeling exposed and cold despite the diner's stuffy heat. The other patrons were statues. The trucker stared intently into his mug. The young couple was now fascinated by the salt shaker on their table. Their complicity was a physical force, pressing down on her, suffocating her. The cook, a burly man named Sal, peeked through the service window, his face a mask of conflict, before retreating back into the clatter and steam of the kitchen. No help would come from there. "I'm sorry about the coffee," Clara said, her voice tight. She tried to pull her wrist away, but his grip was like iron. "That's not what I'm talking about," Vince growled, his thumb rubbing small, invasive circles on her skin. "You're an eyesore. This whole place is an eyesore. And now you got that ugly stain on your shirt. It's disgusting." He leaned closer, his breath a foul mix of stale coffee and cigarettes. "I think you should take it off. It's only fair. You get my table all wet and sticky. You should at least clean up your own mess." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the dull armor of her exhaustion. This was different. This wasn't the usual rudeness, the casual cruelty of a customer on a power trip. This was a violation, a deliberate tearing down of the last shreds of her dignity. He wasn't just complaining, he was hunting, and she was the prey. He tugged at her arm, pulling her slightly off balance. With his other hand, he reached for the collar of her uniform. His thick, calloused fingers brushed against the fabric just above the top button. The gesture was slow, deliberate, a performance for an audience too afraid to watch. He wanted to rip it. He wanted to tear away the last barrier she had, to expose her humiliation for everyone to see. In that moment, the diner wasn't a place of work. It was a cage, and the silence of the onlookers was the lock on the door. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. The touch of his fingers on the fabric of her uniform was a spark on a fuse. In that instant, the diner, with its humming lights and sticky tables, dissolved. Clara was somewhere else. She was standing in a field of sun-scorched grass, the air thick with the smell of dust and diesel. A uniformed officer was handing her a folded flag, his words a meaningless drone against the roaring in her ears. "Regret to inform you, killed in action." A hero. The fabric of that flag had felt impossibly heavy, a weight of honor and grief she had carried ever since. Her husband, Michael, had been a man of quiet strength, a man who believed in standing for something, even if you stood alone. He'd taught her that dignity wasn't something someone could give you. It was something you held on to, something you defended, even when your hands were shaking. That memory was an anchor in the swirling vortex of her fear. She thought of their son, Leo, sleeping in his small bed in their cramped apartment, his breathing a shallow, fragile rhythm. His inhalers sat on the nightstand, expensive little plastic totems that stood between him and a suffocating panic. The money from this shift, the crumpled bills she would smooth out at the end of the night, was for his next refill. It was for the copay on the specialist visit next week. It was for the faint hope that one day, he might be able to run and play without a cloud of fear hanging over him. Every insult she swallowed, every sneer she endured, was a coin she dropped into the jar of his future. She worked double shifts until her feet were numb and her back screamed in protest, all for the quiet, fierce love of a little boy who saw her not as a tired waitress, but as the strongest person in the world. This man, Vince, with his foul breath and cruel eyes, knew nothing of that. He saw a worn-out uniform and a tired face, and he assumed weakness. He assumed he could take whatever he wanted. But he was wrong. He was not just touching a piece of cheap polyester. He was touching the armor she wore to fight for her son. He was desecrating the memory of a man who had died for something he believed in. The quiet strength Michael had possessed now bloomed in her own chest, a hot, defiant flower pushing its way through the cold soil of her fear. She was not just Clara, the waitress. She was Leo's mother. She was Michael's widow. And she would not be broken. Not here. Not tonight. The burn on her hand was a distant throb, a minor complaint compared to the fire that was now hardening her spine into steel. The pressure in the diner had become a living thing, a palpable entity that thickened the air and made it hard to breathe. Vince's fingers tightened on her collar, the fabric straining at the top button. His knuckles were white. His friends, two other men who had been slumped in the booth with him, were now sitting up, their faces lit with a kind of vacant, predatory excitement. They were watching a show, and the curtain was about to rise. The trucker at the counter slowly put his mug down, his big hands balling into fists on the countertop. But he remained seated, a mountain of indecision. The young man in the booth with his girlfriend whispered something to her, and she shook her head, her eyes wide with fear, silently begging him not to get involved. Their fear was a chain, linking them all in a conspiracy of inaction. Clara felt their gazes, their silent refusal to see, to help. It was a loneliness more profound than any she had ever known. She was an island, and the tide of malice was rising. Vince's face was inches from hers, his expression one of triumphant cruelty. He was savoring this moment, drawing it out, feeding on the fear he was creating. "What's the matter, dollface?" he whispered, the words slithering into her ear. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you just ready to be a good girl and do what you're told?" Her pulse was a frantic drum against her skin. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to scream, to claw at his face. But her body was frozen, trapped between the crushing weight of his presence and the unyielding wall of the community's silence. The world had narrowed to this single horrific point. His hand on her shirt, the smell of his breath, the deadness in his eyes. She could feel the button begin to give way, the threads straining. In her mind's eye, she saw Leo's face, his trusting smile. She saw Michael's steady gaze, the way he would look at her when she was scared. A look that said, "You've got this, Clara. You're stronger than you think." The shame of what was about to happen was a bitter taste in her mouth. But beneath it, something else was stirring. A deep, primal resolve. He could tear her uniform, he could humiliate her body, but he could not touch her soul. Not unless she let him. As Vince's fingers tightened, preparing for the final violent tear, a small sound cut through the tension. A tiny whimper. It came from the booth next to Vince's, where a family of 4 had been trying to make themselves invisible. A little girl, no older than Leo, had dropped her fork. It had clattered onto the floor. Now her eyes, wide and terrified, were fixed on the scene. A single tear traced a path through the chocolate ice cream smeared on her cheek. Vince, momentarily distracted by the sound, glanced over. His scowl deepened. In that split second, Clara moved. It was not an act of aggression. It was an act of protection. She didn't push him away or try to strike him. Instead, she twisted her body, placing herself between Vince and the little girl's family. Her movement was fluid, born of a mother's instinct. With her free hand, the one that wasn't trapped in his iron grip, she reached out and steadied the half-eaten birthday cupcake that sat on the edge of the family's table, its single candle still unlit. It was a small, almost absurd gesture in the face of such ugliness, but it was everything. She was shielding innocence. She was defending a small piece of light in a room filled with darkness. She looked directly at Vince, her eyes no longer filled with fear, but with a cold, clear fire. "Leave them alone," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. It was low and steady, imbued with a power that surprised even herself. It was the voice of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. She was no longer pleading for her own dignity. She was commanding respect for the sanctity of a child's world. Vince, caught off guard by this sudden, selfless shift, faltered. His grip on her uniform loosened for a fraction of a second. In that moment, she had not won a fight, but she had changed the terms of the battle. She had taken his power, his ability to isolate and terrify, and turned it into a shield for someone else. She stood her ground, a lone waitress protecting a cupcake, a silent declaration that some things were not for sale and not for breaking. The shift in the diner was as subtle as a change in barometric pressure, but just as powerful. Vince stood frozen, his hands still tangled in her collar, but the momentum was gone. The raw, animal certainty in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of confusion. He had expected her to crumble, to weep, to beg. He had not expected this quiet, unyielding defiance. He had not expected her to ignore her own peril to protect a stranger's cupcake. The sheer absurdity of her action had disarmed him more effectively than any physical struggle could have. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer the silence of fear, but the silence of assessment. The trucker at the counter swiveled on his stool, his gaze now fixed on Vince, his expression hard and unreadable. The young man in the booth, who had been placated by his girlfriend, now gently pushed her hand away and began to slide out of his seat. His face was pale, but his jaw was set. The father of the little girl, who had been staring helplessly at his plate, met Clara's eyes. In them he saw not a victim but a protector. A profound, burning shame washed over him. This woman, a stranger, was doing what he, a father, had been too afraid to do. Stand up to the bully. Whispers started to ripple through the room. Did you see that? He was going to... That poor woman. The words were quiet, but they were stones being dropped into a still pond, each one creating a circle of change. The patrons were no longer just observers. They were witnesses, and their collective gaze was turning, slowly but surely, away from Clara and onto Vince. He could feel it. The power dynamic had been irrevocably altered. He was no longer the predator in control. He was the center of a circle of judgment. He had wanted an audience for her humiliation, but now he was the one on stage, and the crowd was turning against him. His friends shifted uncomfortably in their booth, their smirks fading, their eyes darting toward the door. The air crackled with a new kind of tension, not of fear, but of anticipation. Something had broken, and it wasn't Clara. It was the spell of indifference that had held the diner captive. Then came the sound. It started as a low, distant tremor, a vibration felt more in the bones than in the ears. It grew steadily, a deep, guttural rumble that seemed to be rising from the earth itself. The coffee in the mugs on the counter vibrated, creating tiny, concentric rings on the surface. The windows of the beacon began to rattle in their frames. Every head in the diner turned toward the front door. The rumble swelled into a deafening, thunderous roar as a procession of headlights cut through the darkness of the parking lot, sweeping across the diner's interior like searchlights. One by one, 12 massive Harley-Davidson motorcycles pulled up in a perfect, intimidating line, their engines idling in a synchronized, menacing growl that shook the very foundations of the building. The lead bike cut its engine, and the sudden partial silence was more jarring than the noise had been. The diner door swung open, hitting the small bell above it with a frantic, tinny jingle that sounded like a scream. A man so large he had to duck to get through the doorway stepped inside. He was followed by another and another until 12 men filled the entrance, blocking out the night. They were all huge, clad in worn, road-stained leather vests, cuts, they called them, adorned with the unmistakable winged death's head of the Hells Angels. The patches on their backs read Sonoma County, their leather whispering and creaking as they moved. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence was a statement. They fanned out, their heavy boots thudding on the linoleum with the finality of judges' gavels. They took up positions around the room, some leaning against the counter, others standing by the booths, their arms crossed over their barrel chests. They were a living wall of leather and muscle, their faces hard and weathered, their eyes missing nothing. The air became thick, heavy with the smell of engine oil, old leather, and an unspoken promise of violence. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose that was far more terrifying than any frantic aggression. The entire diner, including Vince and his friends, was now encased. Vince's hand dropped from Clara's uniform as if it had been scorched. The color drained from his face. He had made a terrible, terrible mistake. The men in the back booth, the ones who had been watching, now stood up. They were part of the same group. They had been the vanguard, the silent observers, and now their brothers had arrived to answer a call no one had heard them make. The man who had entered first, clearly the leader, walked forward. He was older than the others, his long gray hair tied back in a ponytail, a thick beard covering a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. A patch on his vest read Preacher. He didn't look at Vince. He didn't acknowledge the terrified patrons. His eyes, a startlingly pale blue, found Clara. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze taking in her stained uniform, the red mark on her wrist, and the defiant fire that still burned in her eyes. He nodded slowly, a small gesture of respect. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to come from the very core of his being. "We saw what you did." His gaze flickered for a moment to the little girl's table, to the cupcake Clara had protected. "Takes guts to stand for something when you're standing alone." Then he turned his attention to Vince. The shift was chilling. The warmth, if it could be called that, vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, flat emptiness that promised a world of pain. "You," Preacher said, the single word hanging in the air like a death sentence. Preacher's pale blue eyes were locked on Vince, and in them, Vince saw a profound and terrifying abyss. This was not a bar fight. This was a reckoning. Preacher took another slow step forward, the creak of his leather boots the only sound in the dead-silent diner. He gestured with a leather-gloved hand toward the back of the diner. "My brothers and I have been enjoying Sal's coffee for the last 2 hours," he said, his voice calm, almost conversational, which only made it more menacing. "We like this place. It's quiet. People here work hard. People like her." He pointed a thick finger at Clara. "She's been on her feet for 10 hours straight. We know because we've been watching." He let that sink in. The bikers hadn't just arrived. They had been there all along, silent judges in the back booth, bearing witness. The revelation sent a fresh wave of shock through the room. They had seen everything. Vince's sneering contempt, the complicity of the silent patrons, and Clara's quiet, desperate dignity. Preacher continued, his voice dropping even lower. "We also know a few other things. We know she's raising a boy on her own. A good kid named Leo. He's got bad asthma. The kind that lands him in the hospital. The kind that costs a fortune in medicine." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the other customers, each one flinching as his eyes passed over them. "This woman works herself to the bone, not for herself, but for him. She comes in here night after night, deals with garbage like you, and does it with her head held high." He took another step, now standing directly in front of Vince, who seemed to have shrunk into the vinyl of the booth. "And her husband," Preacher said, his voice now laced with a dangerous edge of reverence, "was Sergeant Michael Evans, U.S. Army. Died in Kandahar. My nephew served under him. Said he was the best man he ever knew. A man who never, ever backed down from a fight, especially when it was to protect someone weaker." He leaned in close, his face inches from Vince's. "Sergeant Evans was from this town. He's one of ours, which makes his wife and his son one of ours too. You didn't just put your hands on a waitress, you pathetic piece of trash. You put your hands on a soldier's widow. You disrespected a hero's family." In our house, the words fell like hammer blows, each one stripping away another layer of Vince's bravado, revealing the coward beneath. The story of Clara's life, her sacrifice, her hidden strength, was now laid bare for the entire diner to see. She was no longer an anonymous, tired server. She was a gold star wife, a warrior mother, a pillar of quiet courage. The patrons looked at her with new eyes, their shame now mixed with a profound, dawning respect. She was not a victim. She was a monument. The recognition was immediate and absolute. Preacher straightened up and turned away from Vince as if he were something unclean, not worth another moment of his attention. He looked at 2 of the other bikers, massive men with arms like tree trunks. "Road rash. Tiny. Get the trash out of here." There was no argument. The 2 bikers moved with terrifying efficiency. They hauled Vince out of the booth, his feet barely touching the ground. His 2 friends, who had been trying to melt into the upholstery, were grabbed next. They didn't protest, their faces ashen with fear. But this wasn't going to be a simple ejection. Preacher held up a hand. "Wait!" He walked over to the counter and looked at Vince, who was now being held in an unbreakable grip by road rash. "Empty your pockets," Preacher commanded. "All of it. On the counter. Now." Trembling, Vince fumbled in his jeans, pulling out a crumpled wad of bills, some loose change, and his wallet. He threw it all on the countertop with a clatter. Preacher looked at the money, then at Sal, who had emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. "Sal," Preacher said, "figure out what this scum and his friends owe. Then figure out what everyone else in this diner owes for their meals tonight." Sal, his eyes wide, quickly tallied up the bills. "About $120, Preacher." Preacher nodded. He pointed to the pile of cash from Vince's wallet. It was maybe $200. "Pay for everyone's meal out of his money. The rest," he said, looking directly at Clara, "is for you. A tip. For the aggravation." He then turned his cold gaze back to Vince. "You are going to walk out of here, and you are never going to set foot in this town again. If we see your face, if we hear your name, if we even think you're breathing our air, we will find you. And we will teach you a lesson about respect that you will never forget. Do you understand me?" Vince could only manage a frantic, terrified nod. The bikers dragged him and his friends toward the door. As they passed, Preacher reached out and ripped a gaudy patch from Vince's jacket. "You don't deserve to wear colors of any kind." He threw it on the floor and ground it under his heel. Then they were gone, shoved out into the night. The diner was silent for a moment. Then, Preacher walked back to the counter where Clara stood, still stunned. He reached up to his own cut, his fingers working at a small circular patch just below his collar. It wasn't a club patch, but a support patch, one that read in memory of our fallen. He carefully unstitched it from his vest and laid it gently on the counter in front of her. "This is for you," he said softly. "So you know you're not standing alone anymore. You and your boy are under our protection. You need anything, anything at all, you know how to find us." The gesture hung in the air, a profound symbol of allegiance and honor. Then, the trucker at the counter stood up, walked over, and laid a $50 bill next to the patch. "He's right," the trucker said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry I just sat there." The young man from the booth followed, adding a 20. Soon, every patron in the diner was coming to the counter, leaving money, their faces a mixture of shame and genuine admiration. The pile of bills grew, a testament to a community's sudden, powerful awakening. The roar of the 12 Harleys starting up was a synchronized blast of thunder, a triumphant, deafening chorus that rattled the soul. It was not an angry sound now, but a declarative one. Promise kept, a circle of protection closing. One by one, they pulled out of the parking lot, their taillights receding into the darkness like a constellation of fierce, red stars, until the sound faded to a distant, reassuring rumble on the highway. The night air, now cleansed of their noise, rushed in to fill the silence they left behind. Clara stood in the middle of the diner, the world having tilted on its axis and then settled back into a new, unfamiliar alignment. The room was empty now, save for her and Sal. The other patrons had left their money and slipped out quietly, their respectful, averted gazes a stark contrast to their earlier indifference. On the counter before her lay the pile of cash, hundreds of dollars, more than she would make in a week, and resting on top, the small circular patch from Preacher's vest, felt heavier than it looked. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the rough, embroidered edges. In memory of our fallen, it was a sacrament, a token of a tribe she had never known she belonged to. Sal came out from behind the grill, a clean rag in his hand. He didn't say anything. He just started wiping down the counter where Vince had sat, methodically erasing the last physical traces of the man's presence. His movements were slow, deliberate, a quiet act of restoring order. After a long moment, he stopped and looked at Clara. His gruff exterior had crumbled, revealing a deep, paternal concern in his eyes. "You okay, kid?" he asked, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Clara looked from the patch to his face, and for the first time that night, she felt the tight knot of fear and exhaustion in her chest begin to dissolve. A single tear, hot and cleansing, escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. It was not a tear of sadness, but of a profound, overwhelming release. She nodded, unable to speak. "I'm sorry, Clara," Sal said, his voice thick. "I should have." I froze. I'm ashamed. You don't have to be, she whispered, finding her voice. They came. She carefully picked up the patch and held it in her palm. The threads were thick and strong beneath her fingertips. It was more than just a piece of cloth. It was a shield. It was a promise. It was the end of her loneliness. She thought of Leo, safe in his bed, and of Michael, somewhere in the great, vast unknown. She felt his pride, a warm glow spreading through her. She had not fought with her fists, but she had fought. She had held the line. The final image of the night was of Clara, standing alone in the warm, quiet glow of the beacon, the fluorescent lights now seeming less harsh, more like a gentle halo. She slipped the patch into the pocket of her stained uniform, the fabric a comforting weight against her heart. She looked around the small diner, her diner. It was no longer a cage, but a sanctuary. The hum of the lights was no longer a sound of tired decay, but a quiet, steady song of survival. Outside, the darkness was no longer threatening. It was just the night, and somewhere, in the distance, she could almost still hear the fading rumble of the engines, a guardian's lullaby, a promise roaring into the dawn. Respect had been earned, dignity had been defended, and a brotherhood had risen to stand with the strong.